Hello everybody, my name's Niels Buus and I'm the St. Vincents Chair of Mental Health Nursing and the Director of the Centre for Family-Based Mental Health Care. This is the fourth session on Open Dialogue for mental health staff engaged with the St. Vincents Open Dialogue Initiative. There'll be 5 sessions at each site, and before each session all participants prepare by watching a short video clip and reading a text about Open Dialogue. Today we'll be examining the concept and the practice of reflection a bit more, and the accompanying text for today is written by Tom Anderson, who wrote The Reflecting Team, Dialogue and Meta-Dialogue in Clinical Work back in 1987. Tom Anderson and Jaakko Saikola were massively inspired by one another in the late 80s, and it's somewhat difficult to say which practices are linked to Open Dialogue and which practices are linked to Tom Anderson's The Reflecting Team. And some might even argue that there are 2 schools within the Open Dialogue community today, the Tom Anderson fraction and the Jaakko Saikola fraction. Reflection is absolutely central to Open Dialogue. It's built into the network meeting where you've got 2 therapists present. Usually one therapist will be focused on the group and the dynamics in the group and facilitating the dialogue, while the other therapist is more free to observe the interactions taking place and the voices in the room, and to be present and focus on his or her own inner voices. At a point towards the end of a network meeting, the therapist will ask permission to reflect on what they've heard so far. The 2 therapists will then reflect on what they've heard in front of the family and bear witness, but they'll also introduce a slightly different perspective on what they've just heard and a slightly different perspective on how the family members view the situation, or rather view the situations. And this discrepancy, these small differences between perspectives can help families, individuals, to further reflect, to create new meaning around their own perceptions of the situation. At the basis of this practice is a social constructionist perception of social meaning making. In his collection of short stories about Mr. Palomar, Italo Calvino describes Mr. Palomar as walking at night along the coast, and Mr. Palomar can see a triangle in the water where the moonlight is reflected, and wherever he goes, the reflection points at him. The key point here is that whomever walks along the beach will have the same perception that the moon is pointing at them. But if you were situated in the USS Enterprise in a space station above Earth, you would see that the moon actually shines on all the sea. So the point is that we perceive reality individually. Gregory Bateson's take on the same issue is to define information as a difference that makes a difference. And the point here is that there is only meaning when there's an observer that finds something meaningful. Tom Anderson pushes Gregory Bateson's understanding of information further in a very pragmatic way by saying that there are differences that are so minute that they don't make a difference to someone. That's the same as no information. Then there are differences that make a difference to people. And then finally, there are differences that are so huge for someone that they cannot cope with them in a safe way. When you apply these three versions of differences to a group situation, Anderson's point is that you might be able to, as a reflective team, to create differences between what the reflective team is presenting and the perspectives of the family and the social network that are so small that it doesn't really make any change. Going to the opposite extreme, you might introduce a new perspective that is so huge, so challenging, that the family or the persons in the network are not able to use the differences between the reflective team's perspective and their own perspective for anything good. So the art, the clinical challenge, is to create different perspectives, differences between the group and the reflective team that will allow new meaning to arise, that will allow learning to take place in the group. At the beginning of the paper, Tom Anderson describes how they almost stumbled onto the reflecting team after working in a family session where the dialogue between the therapist and the reflecting team, in the beginning sitting behind a one-way screen, became so slow, so problematic that they decided to remove the one-way screen and let the family become audience to the reflective team rather than only being close to or being in interaction with the therapist. He talks about raising three types of questions. It's about mapping the participants' pictures of their situation. It's about mapping their explanations of their situation. And it's about mapping alternatives to their situation. And the whole point here is that the reflective team has got a unique opportunity to not only map these instances, but also to reflect on how come it happens the way in which it does. Tom Anderson illustrates it this way. The figure must be read from left towards right, and right at the left we've got the picture and its explanation. And the first question is to inquire into what must remain the same and what alternatives are available in this situation. And then there's a second order question asking about what's the underlying way of thinking, the underlying epistemology. And pushing it even further, you can ask for an alternative epistemology to the present one. So the family operates or starts out right at the left, and the reflective team is slowly pushing their inquiry into a meta position where they're trying to find out what's the logic behind people's thinking, what are the things that need to stay the same, and how can alternatives be constructed without seriously disturbing the family situation. It's very important to remember that the articulation of reflections must be done as tentative offerings, using phrases like "I was wondering" or "I had the feeling that," and to avoid pronouncements, interpretations, or supervisory remarks, because these actually indicate a type of monologue that we're trying to avoid. It's about indicating the openness with which we're approaching the situation, and we're not trying to rephrase people's experiences, because it could be picked up as a controlling and violent situation. Please remember that the system with the one-way screen is not commonly used in open dialogue network meetings. In these meetings, the group sit in a circle and reflections take place on the edge of these circles. Thank you very much for your attention.